All right, welcome to the Leadership Puzzle, where we explore the pieces that make great leaders whole. I'm your host, Jeff Lupinacci, and today we're diving into one of the most overlooked yet essential aspects of leadership, mental wellness. My guest, Karen Sjoblom, she's a writer, a speaker, nonprofit founder, and author of a deeply moving book, Gone for Good: Lessons from a Midlife Exodus. Karen brings decades of insight into her work in faith and healing and health and wellness. But more importantly, she's lived that experience of navigating grief, burnout, and the beautiful, messy process of personal reinvention. I have been a personal witness to this reinvention, and she is truly a role model. And so, in this episode, we're going to talk about what it means to lead well when you're quietly falling apart, how to notice the signs before breakdown, and why embracing your scars might be the most powerful leadership move you can make. So, grab some coffee, take a seat. You're going to want to sit for this conversation. Karen, welcome to the Leadership Puzzle.
Thank you, Jeff. This is going to be a blast. It's so good to see you today.
Well, you've written a number of books, and gosh, I think I knew you when you had first launched your first books, and you come out with a new one called Gone for Good: Lessons from a Midlife Exodus. That's a really powerful title. Tell us a little bit about the book and how did you come up with this title? What did it mean to you?
Yeah, so I thought that I was going to be just coasting into my empty nest stage. And it turns out that, my kid decided to go back to school or go to school, I should say, back in the Midwest, which is where I was from. And I felt like, golly, maybe it's time to go home. And so I moved cross country and I was expecting a big happily ever after. And that did not happen. So it ended up being a long desert season of dealing with old traumas that bubbled up that I thought had been dealt with. It was dealing with being an empty nester and what kind of things might still be left for me in the world. It was all kinds of things. And so, partway through the book, I learned that the word Exodus, the book of Exodus in the Bible, actually has two meanings. And one of them is the name of God, one of them is the way out. But my trip was kind of starting to mirror the Israelites. So, getting unenslaved from things that I didn't even know were enslaving me and walking through some really dry times. So, Gone for Good, as the title itself, is that sometimes, God asks us to step out in life. And I think that's what I call like leaving home in quotes, like the Israelites did. And that stepping out could be starting a new career. It could be moving cross country like I did. It could be grieving a parent or an empty nest. It's anything that upends our normal routines of things. And so, Gone for Good, as the title, had to do with sometimes there's no going back. Like sometimes we step out and there's no going back. But also, there were things that ended up being gone for good for my good. So, some of the worst of what was still in me that God kind of pried out of me ended up benefiting me greatly in the end. And it was a time of learning and healing that you kind of say, you wouldn't wish it on your worst enemy, but you wouldn't trade it for anything.
Yeah. That is so powerful. I think everybody, whether you're a leader or not, can resonate with this notion of there's something that's got you in chains, whether you know it or not. Um, so that's just super powerful.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times people think that trauma is really the big ticket items. Like I had a very colorful family growing up, there was addiction, there was abuse, there was all that kind of thing. And some people I think feel like they can't use the word or apply the word trauma to them because they didn't have that. But I would argue, Dan Allender talks brilliantly about this, and he's a great speaker as to the recovery community, that there's nobody alive that has escaped the harm of trauma, that there have been disappointments and injustices and all kinds of things that have shaped us and dinged us as we've gone through the world. And so there's just no way to escape it.
Yeah. Well, and probably even when we're kids, we may be having trauma that we don't even realize because our point of reference, I mean, they don't really have a point of reference that says, "Oh, well, this is bad and it's going to impact me,"
Yeah,
until it comes out 40 years later.
exactly.
Right.
Exactly. And I think that we have to remember as leaders, as ministry workers, as, just humans in the world, we bring all of that stuff with us. And I joke sometimes it's like gum on our shoes. It's the stuff that we can't get rid of that follows us through life. And if we're not aware of it, it causes tremendous problems.
So you took that bold, courageous step to actually start dealing with those wounds, those scars that you thought had been healed, but maybe weren't really there. Um, how did you go about starting that, or what, I mean, were you kicking and screaming as God was wanting you to work on that stuff?
Yeah, I really, really thought, because I met you and Molly, obviously, in Oregon, and I had a couple of really hard decades in Oregon. And
Yeah.
I would say I had hard decades before that, just with my family growing up and everything. And I really thought, gosh, I've made it through at that point, 15 years as a single mom, getting my kid to college. And I finally thought, oh, this is my time now. Like I get to find out, what I want and what might be good for me. And that was not it at all. And so I just there was a little kicking and screaming. Like I started out super excited. And part of the book that I think is meaningful to all humans is it goes from leaving, longing, wandering, learning, and trusting. Those are the 5 segments of my book. And I think people are so excited to leave when God has whispered something into their hearts and it's like, it's time to go and it's all going to be great. And then you almost immediately go, this is not what I signed up for. Like, this is harder than I thought it was going to be. And we start longing to go back to what we knew, even when it wasn't healthy, even when it had its own chains involved, enslavement wise. And then we go into a long period of wandering often, and it's super uncomfortable. And you wonder if God really knows what he's talking about. And then slowly the learning, the lessons start coming to fruition. And then finally, I think we get to a place of deeper trust where we know that he always had good for us. We just had to be willing to walk, to hoof it through the desert like the Israelites to get there.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, so just on the surface, why do you think people and certainly leaders, most leaders I knew, they just avoid dealing with this topic altogether? Any thoughts on why?
Yeah, I think, and it was true for me too. I think life often gets in the way. It's a commitment that I think we underestimate anytime we start on a healing journey. We think it's going to be more of a straight line between point A and point B, that it's going to be efficient and it's going to be clean and it's going to be, the way we want it to be. And oftentimes that's not what happens. I would say
Yeah.
most of the time that's not what happens. So I think that part of this is that life gets in the way. I was really fortunate during this last go round in the desert because um, my child was at college. My work had slowed down. So financially, it wasn't great, but responsibility wise, I had the bandwidth to be
Mhm.
able to do this. And then the pandemic happened, and that was even more bandwidth that nobody asked for, right?
Right.
So that's one thing is that we just often don't make time for something like that. Secondly, I think often we overemphasize our strengths as being more important in the world, in the workforce, in our relationships than our weaknesses. And so I recognized I learned a really hard lesson, a good lesson, that everything I always thought was a weakness in me and a detriment in the world's economy, I believe is a superpower in God's economy.
Hmm.
And if we don't stick in it long enough to make that mental switch of what's important, I think we lose out on a huge huge lesson. Like
Interesting.
suffering and grief and learning are so incredibly valuable. And God gets a lot of mileage out of his learning, right? We're supposed to come through us, heal us, move throughout through others. So it's we're stopping the dam if we don't allow transparently, our some of our weaknesses and wounds to come out. And then thirdly, it's just not a ton of fun. It's not a ton of fun to go through this. And so people would rather have fun. But I do believe that trauma work, it can level us, but then it rebuilds us so much more strongly.
Hmm. Well, that whole element of resilience, resilience is has become a very much a business related terminology, a term that is used to describe leaders, especially since COVID. The business world has been in chaos. I mean, there's just
Right.
no one's able to predict anything. And so, you and I have known each other for decades, and you seem to be that person that I look up to for that role model of resilience. I mean, I know enough about your journey to know that you've had lots of hits, you've had lots of things that come against you, and you pick yourself up from the bootstraps and you just
Yeah.
you just go. Um, but obviously, God brought you into this journey to say, no, there's a whole lot more that He wanted for you. So, um, you know, how has this personal journey, your overarching personal journey, shaped your perspective of resilience so that you could be a better self?
So first of all, thank you for your kind words. And I think if anybody knows where all my proverbial bodies are buried, it's you and your wife. So you can always hold that over my head. But I think that, oh my goodness, we all like to think that we're okay. We're managing, we've done enough healing. I would say there's never enough healing. I would say there's always things that we can get better on and clearer about. Um, but something came to me recently, and I have spoken about it in a couple of different arenas. The idea that I think we live to the edges of our wounds.
Hmm.
And so as we heal, our edges get a little bit, a little bit bigger, a little bit bigger and wider, and we're able to do a little bit more. But I also believe that God would rather see us freed from the wounds completely so that we aren't stymied in what we can do in the world. Um, and that personal work is the thing that makes us broaden our edges, if you will. And then also, like I mentioned, I think that trauma is like gum on our shoes. Our wounds don't necessarily cripple us completely, but they color so much. And if we're not aware of our propensities and what activates us, what the little kids in us are still struggling with, um, we just bring it with us. And we bring it with us into our relationships, our
Yeah.
personal relationships, and into our work relationships. And um, so much better to be aware if we can.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. We live to the edges of our wounds.
I
And
just don't know that we can go any further than that if we're not aware.
yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. And so you got to deal with those. I think Allender, gosh, years ago, I heard he's like, you got to go into those wounds. You got to, deal with those wounds. And uh, you know, I was one of those folks who's like, oh, what wounds, right? I had a great
Right.
childhood, and now I'm wiser and a little bit older, and and realize there's probably a little bit more there than I thought.
Right. Right. And they are for all of us.
Yeah.
That's the thing.
Yeah, yeah. So by going in, dealing with our wounds, our traumas, our disappointments,
Yeah,
we're then able to live beyond those boundaries.
I believe so.
That's amazing. Now, when we were first got on, you were talking about a class that you're now
Mhm.
teaching. I believe you called it from trauma to resilience.
Yes.
And so I think this may be a really good time to introduce that because you're talking about a lot of us are driven by our wounds, and you created a matrix to help leaders along that journey of getting through that. Talk to us about the class and maybe about that matrix, and I think that could be really, really valuable for our listeners.
Thank you. Yeah, I had such a blast. It was a regional training for law enforcement chaplains, and it's an international group. And you have to think about the layers of trauma that they're facing. So this kind of class would be great for anybody who's in a helping business or really dealing with people who are hurting. So they have their own, everybody has their own personal trauma, as we described. But then you've got your work trauma because you're dealing with people on the regular, right, who are in trauma and you're trying to help them. So resilience, I think sometimes people like to think that maybe it is just a glorified version of self-care.
Mm.
And I think it's way more than that. And one of the slides that I presented that seemed to be really impactful for the group there was talking about the levels of impact, if you will. And so there was the depleted self, which is you're burned out, you're overworking, you're overdoing. But if you rest and you take care of yourself, you can get over it. You can, if you don't get over it, you tip over into the sacrificial self. And that is really over identifying with people's problems and not recognizing your own limits or God's role in helping them.
Right.
And then finally, if you completely face plant, you get into the wounded self. And that was considered, a complete lack of knowing ourselves, our stories, and our God. So it's a wound of not knowing.
Mm.
And I think that people who are leaders, managers of others who are in helping professions, we tend to think that there's a maybe more responsibility than is accurate is on our shoulders
Huh.
to help others. And that can lead us to burnout and far worse. So part of what I was hoping to work with the chaplains about was for them to understand some of their own wounds, what trauma does to us and our bodies and our brains, and wrapping that all together and giving them this matrix, which is a story, scars, mercy, and mission, which is something that I teach about looking at just a snapshot of your story at a time and going, what was the story? What scars came from it? Where did mercy find you? And then how were things reshaped to make your mission even stronger and make you more empowered to carry out your mission? And so, in very short order, a couple of the chaplains did this writing exercise and just were so surprised at what came out of it. It's just the clarity that comes out of it very quickly. And I think if we look at our disappointments clearly and the things where we felt maybe we failed or were, if we have any self-contempt or those kind of things, there is a way to reframe it, to understand what good could come out of something like that and how we can turn around and use it in our lives, in our work, in our leadership roles. Yeah.
So that's a really simple model.
Super simple. Yeah.
I mean,
But people don't often take the time to go through it and to really sit and think about their stuff for a while. Yeah.
so someone takes 5 minutes and say, okay, picture what's the or what's the story, right? What's that snapshot?
I had written one note to myself to discuss with you, just making this up. So if you came from a super competitive family,
Yeah.
really hard driving, and you had to perform, if you performed, you felt loved.
Hmm.
And if you didn't, maybe you weren't so loved, right?
Right.
If you're not aware of that and you come into a huge leadership position and you are just driving everybody hard, right? Ah, the survival of the fittest environment does not work well for people, right? And so you might have people quitting, you might have people complaining about you, any number of things. If you were to sit down and do this quick matrix and recognize and really tie it together, oh, my dad was a really hard man. Like he was super hard on me. And if I didn't perform and deliver, man, I was, I didn't mean anything.
Yeah.
I wasn't valuable. If you recognize the wound that came from that and then go, okay, now if you're willing to work with God and maybe a trauma therapist and a few other people and go, how then could mercy change you
Mm,
and heal you?
mm,
And you start softening up a little bit and you start supporting people in a different way. And you start recognizing and promoting the things that are adjacent to productive work to make it
mm.
more well-rounded. People want to stay longer, that kind of thing. It's a very simple shift,
Yeah.
not necessarily easy, but simple. Yeah.
Right. No, that's a great example. That's a great example. You know, you were a founder and CEO of a nonprofit, if I remember correctly, Eve's Daughters,
Yep.
and so you know what it's like to be in that leadership role and having that weight on your shoulder, and then of course you work with leaders in your business. As long as I've known you, you've done that as well. So what? What are some early warning signs for, leaders that maybe they're heading towards a burnout or some kind of emotional exhaustion or even something that's preventing them from really being the full successful person that they were created to be.
So I'm happy to share my personal experience with that. So I ran Eve's Daughters before my last little go around with God in the desert. So a lot of learning that happened in recent years. I would say again, this was that wound of not knowing.
Mm,
This was the wound itself, right? So my tendency as a leader there, if I didn't recognize my tendency toward being over responsible to others. That was a long, long, long wound. Like I was responsible for everybody in my family. I was responsible for my mom and my dad and everybody's feelings and so on. And I just thought I'm being helpful.
mm,
Well, you can't be responsible for every human being. Not only is it impossible, but it's completely depleting and it takes away others' agency and others' purpose, and everybody needs to have a sense that they have something to give and do in the world. And sometimes overhelpers can step on those toes
mm.
because they're just trying to handle everything. So that would be a good example of um, a wound of not knowing myself
Right.
and a wound of not knowing my story because I didn't know what I was bringing to the table.
Sure.
And then the part about not knowing my God. I had to learn in recent years, and it was a hard, humbling lesson. God got me out of the savior business, and it wasn't pretty. Just completely cut off. What is God's responsibility toward healing work in this person's life? Where am I? I'm inserting myself where I don't belong, right? So
Right.
that's not knowing what's my responsibility, what's your responsibility, and what's God's responsibility. And so it's that thing about not knowing ourselves, our stories, and our God that is so impactful in a negative way. That those are the things I think that just drive us straight to any level of burnout. So
Sure.
we just don't know.
Sure. Sure. Um, so I mean that's really helpful uh, for leaders, I think. And it kind of goes into one of the topics that you talked about in your book about I think uh, God's wily ways of disentangling us from the after effects of trauma. What is 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 what you've been talking about part of what that means is like him showing and taking pieces out?
I believe so because again, if we buy into the notion that we only live as far as our wounds go, you know, it doesn't matter how many leadership seminars you take or how many books you read or, you know, there's more to it than that. And so getting disentangled from our traumas and our wounds is a way that we can have even greater impact. far-reaching, right? We give goodness to people to carry with them in their lives. And if we're not aware, we can't do that. And if we're
Right.
not supernaturally empowered, we can't do that, in my opinion. So I think that leaders tend to focus a ton on being efficient, but so does God. So nothing is wasted. So even during these really hard seasons, there's nothing that is being wasted. And if leaders are aware of the gifts that can come from their invisible burdens, and they truly are a gift because they're all about growth and change, then I would suggest that people lean into it as much as they're able. And God will handle the details about getting them freed. And then finally, I do believe that happiness is overrated. There's things that are hard, but if you're growing and changing, that in itself is pretty miraculous, I think. And you're also showing others how this is done. You give permission for others to be human and to be messy humans at that.
So, so it brings up an interesting notion of, because I think there's a lot of leaders, especially in the HR world, that want to make room for uh, employees to feel vulnerable and be healthy and emotional integrity and honesty and all that stuff. But do you think that a leader can really lean in and help create those spaces if they haven't done that difficult work themselves to be healthy enough? How would you reconcile that?
Yeah, I think it can be difficult if you are lacking in awareness or even sometimes empathy. I've had some awful bosses in my life, in my younger years, that just did not care if you had an accident on the way to work, they're like, you're late. Just complete lack of awareness and empathy. So I think that those two things are absolutely needed. But for leaders who are maybe struggling themselves and trying to make room for other people to also struggle. I think here the oxygen mask analogy is proper,
Hmm.
that you do need to be taking care of yourself. And more importantly, you don't have to be the last on the list just
Oh,
because you're the
yeah,
boss.
right.
And I think that's sometimes a hard thing for people to remember, right? If you're leading a team, you should always be the last on the list. So, and I also think that it is a support to be transparent with others and to also model hope because there is a big difference between a pressure to be strong, for example, or perfect, even if you want to take it to an extreme, and a desire to encourage others.
Right.
There's a happy medium there. And then you're also, like I say, you're modeling um, the healthy behavior of knowing yourselves and your story and your God and what is yours and what is somebody else's.
Right.
And so I think it's a fine line. We all know people who are who maybe are not able to hold it together very well
Yeah.
in a crisis and who overshare and all those kind of things. So I'm not suggesting that here, but I am suggesting that empathy can go a long, long way. And just as we would share, over meals or whatever stories about raising our kids of like what's hard for us, if somebody wasn't willing to say, I'm struggling right now, like, my kid is driving me up the wall. We're in this terrible place. I would not have gotten any of your wisdom.
Yeah.
And if you guys weren't transparent with me, I wouldn't have been able to offer anything to you. So I do think that there is definitely a space for that when it's done with great awareness and maturity.
Yeah. 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 Now, you know, so if a leader's willing to take some baby steps here, right, and
Mhm.
get started, are there some maybe small practices that you'd recommend a leader do to kind of check in, see how their own emotional health or even spiritual well-being are? I mean, what kind of tools or techniques can someone actually do a quick diagnostic of where am I at?
Right. So as we talked before, like the survival of the fittest environments often don't work well for people. So you don't, I mean, everybody's functioning at their worst and they're most afraid. So if you can avoid that.
Yeah.
One of the things I was thinking about that I have experienced at times in the best work situations is the idea of like having what I would call a 3-word check-in.
Okay.
So it is a way of giving a quick outline of where people are. It's taking the temperature of the room, but it's not diving into too much detail where you have people that are oversharing and getting stuck in their misery, right? So if 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 I were taking care of an elderly relative and trying to handle my workload, right?
Yeah.
And we're in a staff meeting and I have the 3-minute check-in and I can say depleted, concerned, behind.
Hmm.
Can others understand where I'm at without poking and prying and asking a million questions? And it's just as simple as coming up and saying, I feel you right now, been through where you're at. What can I take off your plate for a second?
Right. Right.
And then similarly, if somebody's on top of the world, right? And they're, maybe somebody can say, I really could use some guidance in this area that you're really strong at. Would you be willing to give that to me? So it's a way to be clear without being overly messy and
Right.
intimate,
Yeah.
which I think is important. Um, in the law enforcement chaplain class, I did this exercise about how aware are you of the bottom of your iceberg. So I showed this iceberg with the word anger at the top and then all of the ancillary words underneath it. And I said that for years, I had 2 speeds. I was mad or sad. And I couldn't tell you anything more directed than that. I was just either pissed off or I was crying. I was just 2 speeds. And I said, if you look at all the angry words that are underneath there, it could be because you're feeling vulnerable. It could be that somebody offended you. It could be that you're embarrassed that maybe you offended somebody else. It could be any number of things. And so I really challenged them to say, how aware are you of the bottom of your iceberg and what's going on? That might be another exercise for people to do when you see, for example, if you have workers who are just mad or sad, right? Like,
Yeah.
can you push a little harder to get clear about what's going on and then adjust and address those things? So I love the notion, and I know it's not always realistic, but can we find out through skills testing, through INFA, excuse me, Myers-Briggs, through spiritual gifts testing, any of those kind of things? Can we find out what sets people on fire and like wind them up and turn them loose
Hmm.
in their areas of expertise?
Right.
Um, Oftentimes we're just trying to put out fires in business. And so we don't get the luxury of being able to really customize
Right.
an experience for people. But as much as we're able to, I think that's extremely valuable.
Yeah.
And so, toward that end, I would say also to encourage folks to support each other within reason. I remember thinking back in the day, just even having an opportunity to donate sick time to somebody who was caregiving somebody,
Hmm.
right? Or somebody who could job share or trade tasks toward the end of you're way quicker and more proficient at this than I am. Wouldn't it make more sense for you to do this? And can I take this thing that I do really well off your plate?
Right.
So there's simple things that can happen that I think begin to create space for more transparency and proficiency, honestly, in the organization.
Interesting. Interesting. Yeah, those are certainly some interesting ideas that really are relevant to the business world, for
But
sure.
still very simple.
Oh yeah, yeah,
It wouldn't be a hard thing to incorporate.
yeah, yeah, for sure. Um, Now I know we're kind of running out of time, and there's a couple of questions I want to make sure that we get to. So, can you speak directly to our audience who may be silently struggling right now? What's one truth that you'd like them to remember, and maybe even leveraging Gone for Good as a backdrop for them?
Yeah. My advice is just to keep going. Just keep left foot, right footing it to the edge of your desert because you really can't mess this up.
Hmm.
You really can't. I think that we all go through these really dry growing seasons, and it oftentimes can feel very invisible and sometimes hopeless. But there is always the far side of your desert, and the truth is you exit your deserts differently than you entered them,
Hmm.
and usually in a big way.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Right. Now, I'd love for you to share with the audience, your website, some of the tools and resources that you can bring to them as someone who has lived through this. And I mean, I know, where can they go to get more of you?
Well, thank you. Yes, if they can figure out how to spell my last name, my website is karensjoblom.com. I'm guessing you're going to have this on your show
Yeah.
notes,
Yeah.
so I don't have to spell it out for them. But yes, so there's information there about the different classes that I teach and the value of story work and links to my books and all kinds of stuff like that. But I'm super passionate about people knowing their stories and using that awareness to just bring the best of themselves. Um, to their work, to others, and to recognize, like I said, that supernatural principle of what maybe they felt they were deficient somehow or had self contempt over, or whatever it may be, to find out that those are the things that can be just superpowered as we go through our healing and be used to help others. It's just amazing.
Oh, well, Karen, this has just been a fantastic conversation. I'd love for you to come back and join us again and dig into a little bit more of these topics.
Thank you so much, Jeff. It's been a blast.
All right.
Appreciate it.
Well, thank you for joining us on this episode of the Leadership Puzzle. Karen has reminded us that true leadership isn't about having it all together. It's about having the courage to be real, to heal, and to lead others to that place of wholeness. So, if this episode spoke to you, share it with a friend or a colleague who may need this reminder that their wellness matters as well. And don't forget to check out Karen's book, Gone for Good, and her website, KarenSjoblom.com. And so until next time, keep on showing up, keep piecing together your own leadership puzzle, and take care of yourself along the way.